you.
So I'm a bit thrown now. We practiced this and the share screen came up. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yes.
Fab. In that case, I'll start it. Right. So it was really interesting hearing some of your stories today, because I'm not a grandparent. And about 3 years ago, Rachel Turner, who was then our boss, turned to me in a meeting and said, we need to write a book on grandparents and you're going to write it. And I'm like, really? Because I'd never written a book. So kind of to help, we took a bit of a deep dive, or relatively deep dive for me, into what being a grandparent, a Christian grandparent, was like. So alongside looking at research and things like that, I interviewed some Christian grandparents and said, tell me what it's like. Tell me, what are the best bits, the worst bits, what are the struggles? And I wasn't surprised, I think, because before this job, I worked in church as a children and families minister, to discover that it's not very straightforward. Not always just in matters of faith, but we talked about now some of your stories about grandchildren living a long way away. There were stories of family dynamics and distance and the blurring of the boundaries. Can I share faith or not? And so we also interviewed, which was really interesting, Christian grandchildren of grandparents, Christian grandparents. So we said, what difference did faith make? And we got all sorts of stories, which if you have a copy of the book, you'll see peppered through it. But one of the main things to come out, and we'll just unpack this a little bit more in a minute, was that actually grandparents did all sorts of things without realizing it that communicated their faith. And that should be a great encouragement to you. But so why the book? Well, we knew, having run courses and written books, that we often had grandparents come on our courses and say, this is really good stuff. I can see how it might work, but it's really different when you're a grandparent, because we're not in the home every day. Things are a little bit different, and we're aware of that. And sometimes we would have, I ran courses in my church, have grandparents come in who would find it, some of them almost distressing to be there, because their own children hadn't chosen to continue with faith, and they felt ashamed or guilty or just very sad about it. And it soon became clear that grandparenting for faith is quite complex. And then when we were looking at this a little bit more, Sarah's research came out with the first bit of it. And there were two things that really struck me from that, which we've tried to address in the book. One is that a lot of Christian grandparents lack confidence in the role. What are my boundaries? What am I meant to do? Can I do it? And the other thing was that they were not sure how to actually,
is that okay?
Practically share faith with their grandchildren. How can I do it? Some people said, well, nobody's ever shown me, so I don't know. What are the good ideas? So this seminar is actually about the first bit of that, about why God created grandparents. And I hope we got 3 truths we've looked at, which I hope might be, some of you may be really aware of it, some of it might be game changers, particularly if you feel quite unsure about your role. And in Rachel Turner's second seminar, the other seminar on this stream rather, is going to be about some practical things you can do to share faith with your grandparents. So we've got a title, Why Did God Create Grandparents? Now, I'm not a grandparent, but my friend became a grandparent about 5 years ago, and it absolutely changed her life. She went from being this kind of like, I'm not really sure I can do this, I'm not even sure I like having a baby around anymore, to the most besotted person I've ever seen in my life. She can't wait to pick them up from nursery or to rush over to babysit. She turns me down for coffee quite frequently because the grandchildren are over. She has, like I think we all do for our own children, we have hopes and dreams, but grandparents have hopes and dreams for their grandchildren too. And when you're a Christian, the hopes and dreams of people you love will always include meeting and knowing God, won't they? Because that's the greatest gift, to help them meet and know God. And I don't think it's a coincidence you have this yearning inside you for your grandchildren to meet and know God, because that's actually how God's created you. He didn't create you to sit in a rocking chair and suck Werther's originals. He created you to be an essential part of the team surrounding your grandchildren and their families. Now, I know at this point, we've already touched on it. There are so many variations of being a grandparent. You may have questions about, but I don't see them very often, or they're hostile to my faith. We have tricky family dynamics, all those things. But let's just put those aside for a moment while we think about why God created grandparents. And as I said, we've got three really important truths we want to share this morning. And the first one is that you are influential and you can influence your grandchildren. Just for a moment, I'll give you about 20 seconds in your head, because I don't think we can have a big chat or we'll have so much feedback we won't know what we're doing. What did you see or learn from your own grandparents that still influence you today? Bizarrely, one of mine is that I support Sheffield United for no other reason than my grandfather was passionate about them. I don't go to see them play. I have no idea where they are in the league, but I would describe myself as a Sheffield United supporter for Popper. I also, because of his wife, my grandma, believe firmly that roast lamb is the only proper Sunday lunch ever, because she was so passionate about that. From my other grandma, I feel strangely connected to Camberwell in South London. Never lived there, never go there, but that's where she lived. In this sense, you've probably got similar experiences. I think we are shaped more than we know by our grandparents sometimes. It's something to do with identity, isn't it? They're part of me. And so we find ourselves shaped by our grandparents. Now, Sarah's research said that a lot of grandparents don't feel that they can influence their grandchildren spiritually. So this question is one that I set out to explore when I started writing the book. Now, we know what God's plan for children's discipleship is, and it's in Deuteronomy. To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, to memorize his laws, tell them to your children over and over again, talk about them all the time, whether you're at home or walking along the road or going to bed at night or getting up in the morning. We're all familiar with that. And the essence of that is that discipling happens in the ordinary everyday bits of life. You know, church is important, has an important role, but actually it's the family that surrounds the child, which is where we learn, isn't it? I mean, probably in your family, you've got things that you do, you know, maybe a passion for DIY, and that seems to get passed through the family, or baking, or we have a family at church all into musical theatre, and oh my goodness, they just learn it off each other. You know, I have a friend who loves trains, and lo and behold, his grandson loves trains, you know. We pass on our passions, we're shaped by our families, and faith is transmitted in a similar way. Sometimes we deliberately drip feed bits in. The rest of the time, we're just going about our normal everyday lives, and how we do faith, the impact God has on us, is sometimes just oozes out of us. And people see it, children and grandchildren do see it and take notice. But the question is, where do grandparents fit in? Because, of course, in Moses' day, when God gave this instruction, most grandparents lived in the next door tent, didn't they? Because we lived in those little communities, the villages. So the grandparents were a natural part of the extended family surrounding the child. So a grandparent would normally be chatting to a child at random times of the day. So they would be part of this experience of sharing faith in the everyday. Now, of course, we know that very few of us live in the tent next door, one or two maybe. But for most grandparents, the experience is that you live some physical distance away from your grandchildren, but also life's very different. It's much busier. Children are busier. Families are busier. And in Moses' days, all the Israelites had one faith. They all worshipped God. We now have a very different society. So the question is this still true, that grandparents can be part of the everyday parenting and the everyday spiritual parenting of their grandchildren? we say the answer is yes. But I'll show you where we started. We started by digging in to some secular research about grandparents and were they or weren't they influential. And what we found was that grandparents can have significant influence on their grandchildren just because they're grandparents. So I obviously can't operate my own slides. There was a gentleman named Carl Pillemer from Cornell University. He did some research into the influence of grandparents on grandchildren and found a staggering 90% of grandchildren said that their grandparents influenced their values and behaviors. 90%. And that's in America, similar culture to ours. You know, distance is a thing, time's a thing. Grandparents are unlikely to be cheek by jowl. 90% of grandchildren ascribed their grandparents influencing them. And closer to home, Oxford University did a big piece of work in 2009 on grandparenting. And they found that when grandparents and grandchildren connected, it kind of boosted everything, even your health, physical health. But grandchildren with a connection, close connection with their grandparents had better mental health. They were more grounded. They were more resilient. They even had better friendships with their peers because of the relationship with their grandparent. You know, grandparents seem to punch above their weight when it comes to their influence on grandchildren. So the next question we asked her, well, is the same true of spiritually influencing your grandchildren? And there was a man called Vern Bengtson who, over 35 years, he and his team followed 350 families in America to see how faith was transmitted through the generations. So that I think they interviewed them, you know, at the beginning of it, and they kept going back at regular intervals to follow the stories. And there's a book called Families and Faith, which unpacks that, which is fascinating. But there's a chapter, which I don't think he expected to write, which talked about the unexpected influence of grandparents. And what he discovered was that even where the parents had no faith and practiced no faith, there was a link between a grandparent of faith and a grandchild that was unexpectedly influential. I expect you've all had stories. We had a curate once who came along. His parents had no faith at all, but he looked at me one day and said, I had a praying grandma. And I don't know whether she was still alive to see him ordained, but, you know, God doesn't allow anything not to work. He honors the grandparents' role. So we did some research ourselves when we talked to grandparents, and we discovered that faith is transmitted in the really ordinary, everyday bits of life. And so this was the conclusion we drew about influence, simply because you're a grandparent, not because you're a particular sort of grandparent or you're a busy, active grandparent, simply because you are a grandparent. God has positioned you so you can help your grandchildren meet and know God. God's design, and we'll unpack this a little bit more in the next bit, is that there's such a special relationship between grandparents and grandchildren that you have this role. So even if you don't live cheek by jowl with your grandparents, you are still part of that particular support network that sits immediately outside the nuclear family. In effect, you're more influential than you know. And so we're going to move on to truth number 2. You are designed to connect with your grandchildren and they with you. I was struck by, in Sarah's keynote, how she unpicked a little bit the fact that there seems to be, again, secular research seems to show that there is a natural and very particular connection between grandchildren and grandparents. When I was researching for the book, I've read this really fascinating little article which talked about grandmas, and these grandmas were shown pictures of their daughters, who are the mother of their grandchild, their daughter and their grandchild, a baby grandchild, and another woman of a similar age, another similar age baby, shown 4 photos, and they put grandma in a scanner, an MRI scanner, and they watched what happened to her brain. And effectively, you know, when she was shown the pictures of people she wasn't related to, there was interest. when she was showing the picture of her adult child, the mother of this grandchild, her brain lit up in the areas of what they called intellectual empathy. You know, she was concerned about it. It was nice to see her. How was she? How was she doing? But when they showed her the picture of the grandchild, it was like her brain fizzed with the emotional empathy bits lighting up. There was something that just went, this is my grandchild and I adore them. You know, God's designed our brains so that you have this particular connection. You know, when I grew up, we weren't close to my grandparents at all. It was kind of possibly a generational thing, a distance thing. And so I didn't see them regularly. I didn't feel particularly attached to them, but there was something in me that craved that attachment to them. I wanted to be connected. I owned them. They were mine. They were special. They were part of me. I was interested in them and their behaviors. There was this thing in me that was going, these are your grandparents and they're special people and they're particular to you. So the question is, why is it so important that we have this special connection? Why has God created this special connection? Well, it's really straightforward. It's when we're well connected to somebody, good things get transmitted down the connection. It's almost like we had a little blockage in our water pipes recently, and we had to get the plumber out, you know, and there was something stopping that water flowing through. But when we have a good connection, it's like there's a clear flow through of all sorts of good things, not just information, ideas, but there's that trust that allows people to be vulnerable and a willingness to listen. Some of the feedback from the grandchildren we spoke to was quite clear. You know, why were your grandparents able to influence them? Because I felt connected to them, because I trusted them, because I felt I could believe what they said. And that was repeated over and over again. It was a very simple formula, if you like. If I know I'm connected to my grandparents, then I'm going to be influenced by them. So it stands that the more strongly connected you are to your grandchildren, the better positioned you are to help them meet and know God. And so I thought, well, what helps build this connection? I came across a bit of research by two researchers in America called Merrill and Ruiz. And they said there are three things when you're thinking about how you connect with your grandchildren which make a difference. And the first is emotional closeness. So that's not just loving someone. The emotional closeness they described was really, and I've described it as an in my bones, we're special to each other. We have a unique relationship. It's a feeling that your lives are intertwined. And so the question is how to grow that emotional closeness. And they said it's about really getting to know your grandchildren as individuals. My grandparents knew that I went to school. They might get a copy of my school report or see a photo of something I'd done. The difference is when you're closely entwined, you ask them what's going on, you get involved and you get into their world, you know their world, you're curious, you ask questions, you spend time. Some of you are able to spend time with grandchildren on their own, those precious times where the specialness of the relationship, where you can just get to know each other really well. But the other half of that emotional closeness is that let them know the relationship's not just one way. Very often children are poised, aren't they, to receive lots and from adults around them. But it's really powerful to let them know that they bless your life, that you get something really particular and individual from them. So for a baby, that might be, or a toddler, it might be just saying to them, when you hug me, I feel so happy. And that empowers the grandchild, that they bring something unique to your relationship. You know, if you say to a slightly older child, oh, the way you carried that shopping bag for me when we went out together, that really helped me, thank you. Or the video you sent me over had me laughing for ages. This thing that your relationship isn't just about emotional closeness, but it's mutually beneficial, and they bring this uniqueness, the thing that only you and they have. The second thing is they talked about was regular contact. I've got a friend called Mike. His mum is 87, and we were talking about grandparenting. And Mike said to me, and it absolutely staggered me, my mum has taught herself to use WhatsApp so she can message all the grandchildren. And I was like, one, really impressed that this 87-year-old had taught herself WhatsApp. But two, the thing that staggered me was this idea that she was making random contact with her grandchildren just to let them know she was there, that Nana would pop up on their phone. And these are adult grandchildren. And I just saw the power of that regular contact. And we are blessed, aren't we, with technology. We can make contact with people even on the other side of the world. It's not the same as being in the same room, but it's a really positive way we can be in touch with other people. If your grandchildren in this country, you could pop a little present in the post or a card, something unexpected. Some of the power of this is to be proactive. My grandparents were very good at reacting. If I rang them or if I wrote them a card or something, I'd get a response. But if you are proactive in initiating that contact, or just offering I'm just calling you just to say hello. It's the power of that is it says, hey, you're special and I'm thinking of you. So regular contact, creative, tiny gift here and there, a little phone call. People talk about sending videos of their day to their grandchildren, sharing a funny joke you saw. Is just so powerful because of the message it conveys about their worth to you. And the third thing she talked about was being a source of social support. Now, Sarah mentioned this. I have to say, when I came across that, I had to Google it. I'm like, what is social support? And it turns out that all it is something I bet you're already doing for your grandchildren, is to let them know that you are there for them no matter what. So it's a kind of an unconditional love thing, but and also saying, I'm here, you can depend on me. And essentially, I'm not going to judge you. Some of the research into the importance of teenagers' mental health of the grandparents was when a teenager who maybe was having trouble at home felt able to go to their grandparents because they knew that come what may, their grandparents would be there for them. Not necessarily to agree with everything, but to not be shocked, to say, yes, I'm here and I'll listen. It's not about being a doormat, but it's about saying, I'm a dependable person in your life who will be there for you, maybe in practical things like picking up, but more importantly, to listen, to talk, to have the time for them. This thing about connection is God's designed, fascinating, isn't it, that he's designed grandparents and grandchildren to have what seems to be a completely unique type of connection, different from those they'll have with their peers or even their parents. He's designed you and your grandchildren to seek connection. And when you're actively connected to your grandchildren, you will be better able to share faith with them. So the first truth is that you are influential. And the second truth is that the more connected you are, the easier sharing faith will be. Because remember that sharing faith isn't always about words. It's about what people observe around you. Children are taking in all the time the world around them, and they'll be evaluating it. They'll be working out which bits, maybe things they want to pick up. And you'll also be a safe place for them to explore big questions. So even if your grandchildren don't have faith or can't talk about faith at home, you may be that safe place for them where those conversations can take place. So truth number 3, God knows what families are like, and you can grandparent for faith when life's not perfect. So one of the things that really surprised me when I started talking to grandparents was, these are all Christian grandparents, how quickly they all said, it's really hard, actually. And it wasn't that they all had particularly traumatic families or anything like that. It was that you're one step removed. One of them said, we're one step removed, we're behind the parents. You're not in control of your grandchildren's lives. You can't shape their experiences in the way that you can. If your children make decisions that you don't like, you can't interfere in the same way. Sometimes you just have to step back. And then there are natural things that happen, illnesses, divorce, grandchildren moving away, long distances. You know, life is rarely perfect. There are going to be hiccups on the way. And grandparents also talked about when they felt maybe frail or tired or had less time. You know, as grandparents, you're not always going to have, you know, 100% energy, 100% time. But God knows what families are like. And we will say at Parenting for Faith, you know, he's designed discipleship to work on your worst day, not just your best day. And it's the same with grandparents. And we realize that there's so many variations. Just thinking about the grandparents in my own church, there are grandparents who are forbidden completely from talking about faith. There are those with grandchildren who are really quite poorly. Some have very little contact. Some have grandchildren in Tasmania. Some have families where the family dynamics make everything hard. And I realized that grandparents can feel confused or conflicted or even powerless as they look at their families and say, well, how can I share faith with them? You know, God made grandparents and he made families, and God's purpose for you to be that supportive, faith-sharing people that surround the family doesn't change simply because life is tough. There's a whole chapter in the book called No One Said It Would Be Easy, which kind of addresses we looked at some of the key situations families found themselves in. I just want to share a few principles from that chapter. Again, mainly to always pray, to build connection with your grandchildren, with your family. Keep that connection as strong as possible. Respect the parents' views on faith, and that can be a really tough one, but don't overstep the boundaries. Ask permission, but you may not get it. Know that God doesn't expect you to do more than you can manage. I imagine, particularly if your family doesn't have faith, that you feel a great burden and responsibility, but God's on the case too. Faith, as we touched on, faith is more than words. Your actions, your beliefs, even things like the pictures in your house will all be speaking. And God is working too. And that's so important to remember. You're not in this alone. You know, being a grandparent is never going to be a bed of roses. But God is able to work in you and through you in all of it. And that, you know, I know from my own particular family circumstances, that can feel very hard at points. But it's a truth. God is always working to bring people to know him, because that's what he wants even more than we do. So I've got a little bit of encouragement for you for the end of this. When I was writing the book, I came across a video, and it was of a watercolor, and it was a watercolor tutorial how to paint a picture of poppies. And I got really hooked in, and I started watching, and the artist put like these really random dots of color on the canvas, and I watched fascinated as these dots joined together to make this beautiful picture. But they were very random dots, and God said to me, discipleship's like that. You don't give everybody a full picture of me straight away. Your grandchildren will pick up little dots from you, little dots of information, of knowledge, of what they see, and they will be beginning to shape their own picture. And God's adding dots, and other people are adding dots as well. So your job is not to paint the whole picture of who God is. Your job's to dip in the splashes and the dots that you can, and God will do the rest. So we've reached the end of our time. So we'll be sucked back into the main room in a minute. Do be encouraged. You're influential. God's designed you to connect well with your grandchildren, and you can help and meet them know God even when the situation's not perfect. There will be time at the end of this morning for Q&As if you have any, but otherwise, thank you very much.
Thank you, Becky. We're going to stop recording now, okay?